Liza Field is a
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sherman.
Liza Field is a Roanoke native, and she's an avid tree planter, land saver, and a wildlife landscaper. She also teaches English and philosophy over her career, and she's recently she's written a number. She writes for the Roanoke Times. She's written a number of thoughtful articles about nature, and including one recent some time ago that was about peace, pilgrimages, and nature. She loves mountains, creeks, owls, whippoorwills, forest, and she is deeply troubled by what's happening with the earth right now. And she's doing her best to say that while she's still part of it. Her big project recently has been the acquisition of 80 acres of land near Camp Bethel, and it has a conservation easement aiming towards protecting it as future old growth forest, and she is really into green burial, and she might talk a little bit about that during the talk. Liza Field.
I'm sorry, Liza. I wanted to add too that Plowshare has an active email list and mailing list. If you'd like to be on it, please put your mailing address and/or your email address in the chat. We don't send out a lot of emails, so you won't be swamped, but you'll get to know about our events like tonight if you are on our email list. We also have a quarterly newsletter, which I'm about to send out on Monday, and you put your mailing address, you'll get that too. Thanks. Go ahead, Liza.
That would be great. And thank you for whoever at Plowshare snail mailed me some of the newsletters this past year and previously too. Great. Yes, I just was able to acquire mostly forested land up here in Botetourt County near Camp Bethel. And my first priority was getting the conservation easement going. And the topic tonight that I picked is close to my heart probably because I love to eat, but the topic is metabolism. And I tend to see things in symbols, which is not really what our culture does now. We don't read symbols very well. We're quite literalist. Well, Charlie Fenn does. You know, he's got incredible poems, and Joyce does with their music, and you know, probably Sherman and Michael and Susan. If you're a church rector or a minister or a teacher, like the way that Michael even taught science, you do see symbols, and you have to be familiar with that terrain. But one of the main symbols that I see in our time is people are having, as we speak, Gary has been through horrific pain with, I don't know if you want to mention it, Gary, but.
Just passing kidney stones, that's all.
Right. And it's so many people, it seems like digestive tract issues, oddly enough, are very, or the whole metabolic system that keeps us alive. People are having a lot of trouble with that now, and we hear about wheat belly or you know, gluten and all kinds of peanut issues and everything like that, and how to heal the gut. I think on the larger level, we all see it in the environment. You know, we've seen it for really decades now. Shoveling stuff down, shoveling it in, shoveling the landfills filling, the oceans gagging with plastic, just this growing tide of indigestion that had, partly because I think we as humans have been making the decisions on the planet for a long time, and we ourselves have not wanted to have to digest the difficult things. And so here it is, 9/11, and I was thinking about, 21 years ago, just listening to well, I was actually down at Grayson Highlands and Joyce in the Rouse, Joyce and Richards County. And I've gone down there every year in early September for a little private pilgrimage, just like a little spiritual retreat. And when I was climbing the mountain with my car, climbing up White Top, which we call What Top down there, all the campers and RVs were pouring down the mountain. And it was about 11 o'clock in the morning on 9/11. And I had just met in Whitfield, they were bringing in a Walmart. And when they brought the Walmart in, it had to be rezoned, Walmart and Lowe's, in the sea of asphalt that would come with it. It had been a dairy farm. And when they had the zoning, the public hearing about the zoning, I was one of 3 people that opposed the rezoning for the Walmart. And there were 200 people that showed up in support of the Walmart at that time. They had been prepared by the industry that that bad people would be coming, the environmentalists would be coming. And so they poured into the meeting. We had to move it to the high school gym. But once it was established, and they rezoned, the town manager and his assistant agreed to work with me to require the developer to plant trees, and all that asphalt. So we had met that morning at 9/11, the assistant town manager and I out in this future sea of asphalt and showing how the water would be supposedly going down into the tree areas. And I remember he looked up and he saw military jets fly over. And but I just got in the car and went on down to Grayson Highlands, and there at the campground had been completely emptied out. And one reserve Army guy was there with his son, and he told me what had happened. But I remember then I tuned into NPR from my little Walkman that I had at the time. And I remember that people were saying, okay, the world has completely changed now. Everything has changed after this. We have been attacked by terrorists. And I remember walking around up in the mountains there thinking, well, I have felt that way for a long time because of the environmental devastation. I have felt the devastation that people are just now beginning to feel because of this incident. And I actually felt hopeful that we could now finally digest something terrible and be transformed and work together. Okay, we're one planet. These people have attacked us. Maybe it's a good time for us to figure out why and look at ourselves. And Nikki Giovanni, I think she just retired maybe at Virginia Tech, but she had become poet in residence there. And Virginia Public Radio interviewed her about it. And she said, this is time for us to pause and reflect. And she said, what we really need is elders who can help us to digest this and to look at ourselves and to take a pause. And in the old cultures, it would have been a day of penitence or a week or a fast, a ritual of mourning, sackcloth and ashes, and that kind of thing, ritual grief, and what the old desert fathers called compunction. But she said, I'm afraid that we're not going to have that. And, she said this probably on the 12th, the day after. And sure enough, y'all know, being the peace folks, who've carried the torch for the past however many years all of you have been involved, probably your whole adult lives, whether with Plowshares or some other venue, but you have been the peacemakers and the people who have hungered and thirsted for righteousness, like in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and for peace, blessed are the peacemakers. It's very, very difficult calling, because you find yourself among Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called humankind a multi-grade schoolroom. So we've all been I was a terrible kid, just horrible to my teachers. And I, have had to look back at that, and most of them had gone on by the time I realized it, and, really felt compunction and great sadness for all the effort that they had put into it. But I was a prankster. I wanted a ruckus. I was not a peaceful child. I loved to have controversy and upset people with some kind of prank going off. Back in my day, it was poo-poo cushions and fake vomit on the floor. I don't know if those of you old enough to remember, we could get plastic vomit and plastic dog poop and put it out in the hall. And so it's a multi-grade classroom. And so you find yourself as a peacemaker, somebody craving, especially at this time in the age of rampant vomit loads of propaganda pouring out. And you find yourself among folks. I don't know how many of you have lost friends to the QAnon or to MAGA, or I lost my best friend to MAGA, and it's very difficult. And there's one of the Psalms in the Bible. I have a lot of Christian references only because I was an Episcopalian, so we are drenched and steeped in scripture growing up. And but I think you can find it in the Buddha's sayings, the Dhammapada or the Tao Te Ching. So many of these really are saying the same things. But one of the Psalms is one of the complainer Psalms. And the older that you get, the more helpful those Psalms are. The dark Psalms, or Gerard Manley Hopkins's dark sonnets, or whatever they're called. I remember reading them when I was young, like, this is horrible. This is so depressing. But then you get older and they are great digestive aids. These people who processed quite a bit of violence and suffering and non-peacefulness before us, and digested it, and it helps us to do it. So one of these Psalms says, why do the wicked prosper? And, I am for peace. But when I say that I am for peace, they are not for peace. And so how do you make peace with people who don't want peace? It's a dilemma. And so back to the original 9/11, the earlier 9/11, what happened? Well, immediately, as Nikki Giovanni predicted, we would not take a pause. And we were off to war. I think was it within 3 days, y'all? Something like 3 days, I think. Within 2 or 3 days, we were having a war with Afghanistan, and this was going to solve our problems. And of course, the whole military complex that y'all know better about than I even, but or certainly know more about than I, the funding, the lobbying. And so they're just raring to go. And Blackwater, Halliburton, Boeing, whoever jockeys for these contracts, just love a good war. And here was a reason to have one. And I remember asking people around me at the time, like even at the college, by the way, I'm not teaching now. I'm not a teacher at this time. So just forgot to amend that. But at the time, even in the academic context, asking intelligent people around me, like, why are we going to war? This is not like the right response. And y'all, I'm sure, had the same knowledge. It was completely inappropriate. The terrorists, and I remember they would say, well, we're going to hunt you down and kill you. And I remember thinking, it's like a no-brainer. They're already dead. And obviously they didn't mind dying. So what kind of leverage do we have by offering to kill them when they're already ready to die? So that wasn't going to work, but we did it anyway. And so we're off to Afghanistan, and we're blowing up caves, like for looking for bin Laden or whatever. And I remember thinking, like, gosh, I wonder how much wildlife is down there living in those caves. And let alone the people just trying to survive and their little communities, and the bewildering aspect of having young Americans go in who don't speak the language and don't know the culture, and what that did to them. So then a couple of years later, it's like, well, that's not enough. Now we're going to go do this in Iraq. And part of being a peace craver, a peacemaker where you can be, but when another person does not want peace, you can't shove it at them. You can't demand that. You yourself have to be metabolized. You have to agree to their terms. And so the person of peace has to eat a lot of mistakes that they didn't make. They've made enough. We've all made enough mistakes that other people had to eat. And the earth has had to eat all of our mistakes. And I just use the example of growing up and being kind of a hellion in school. How many other people had to eat my trouble that I caused, let alone in other areas of life. But so today, I was thinking about that recently, like, wow, it's the same is true with climate change. Many of us knew, Joyce certainly, Joyce and Richard and Charlie and Michael and everybody here knew decades ago that climate change was real, and we were all trying our hardest to get something done about it and changing our lives best that we could. Joyce probably takes the award for that with windmills and things, but going around singing about it and trying to make music out of this devastating reality. And so now what's happening? Exactly what the climate scientists predicted, only faster. And so back when Al Gore, talk about a person who could metabolize a problem and turn it into the good. He lost the election in 2000. Maybe he didn't lose it. I think that's still up in the air, although I heard recently that they researched that after it was near 9/11. It was around this time, 21 years ago, that they found he probably did win the Florida votes, but they chose not to say anything because we had been attacked, and they thought it would be divisive. And he was willing to eat that. And he ate that in a very gracious way. And he turned himself to working for climate action and creating a documentary film, and how much ridicule, the whole system was set up with big oil to attack the climate scientists. The one that we had at UVA that was attacked by Ken Cuccinelli, Michael Mann, I think was his name, was a climate scientist, and I think he went to Penn State. But I read an article later about what the climate scientists like he went through. They were persecuted, by the fake think tanks that attacked the tobacco research back in the 70s. And the tobacco companies funded them to come out with fake research about how great cigarette smoke was for you. And those think tanks were all funded and ready to go and ready for some new money to come in. And it came in from the big oil people so that they could put out more fake science and attack the characters of these climate scientists. But so Al Gore was also, of course, just mercilessly ridiculed and crucified. And I think he held up pretty well. But so we all knew this a long time ago. And now, a tornado comes in there's supposed to be a little rainstorm, and the next thing you know, a whole Kentucky town is wiped out. There's no telling what's gonna, and then the entire countries are getting swallowed by the ocean now, and the climate refugees, the migrant, I think that's what you call it, people, well, there's no water. East Africa has been in a drought for decades now. India's about to run out of water. The Midwest, the aquifer here, nobody stopped it. They're just pumping out water as if there's no tomorrow. So we're getting our wheat and corn and vegetables from fossil water. We've been doing that for a long time. And I don't know if y'all have heard this, but it's been happening for at least a decade. Saudi Arabia has gotten a taste for beefsteak. And if you have enough money, it's too expensive. They need the wheat to feed the cows or the corn or whatever. It's too expensive to import water, so that they can grow, or import the hay. So they come to the US and they invest in real estate in the Midwest. They'll buy huge amounts of acreage because they get free water. And the laws have not changed. So you can stick a straw down into the aquifer and pump out water to grow your short root wheat crop. And then you send your wheat back to Saudi Arabia or wherever to feed the cows there. So, these things are happening now. And, I was thinking this and 9/11, most of us knew it was the wrong idea to go to war. But if you spoke up at that time, if you spoke about the climate or the war, like you make a peace effort, you go down on the Roanoke City Market and hold up some signs. And I don't know how much grief people got for doing that, especially right after 9/11, or right after we had declared these wars. But I remember these people were, the peace protesters were called appeasers. You were appeasing, like Prime Minister Chamberlain did to Hitler, before Churchill. Like he was considered an appeaser. He kept trying to appease Hitler. So people who spoke up against these wars, well, you're just appeasing this terrible Saddam Hussein or whoever they were blaming at the time, and you're not patriotic. You don't support our troops. All kinds of stuff coming up at that time. And then I remember watching the 2016 primaries, the Republican primaries. I guess we had our candidates. It was either going to be Bernie or Hillary, I don't know. I'm an independent voter, but I certainly vote for some environmental sanity. So, but the Republican primaries were huge. And I think there were 16 candidates for a long time. And I remember it got so vicious that people could not let their children watch it. School teachers would be assigning, okay, children, this is our democracy. Go watch the primaries. It's going to be on tonight. And they had to stop doing that because it got so raunchy and vicious. But I was surprised. I guess that Trump brought it up, and he began to ridicule the Bush administration. And he said, this whole stupid war, the Iraq war, it was so stupid and wasteful. It was a huge mistake. And that was the establishment, and I'm different, and I remember thinking the same people that began to support him were the same people that ridiculed the peace protesters, the ones who knew the whole time that it was the wrong idea. But if you're a person of peace and you really crave harmony, and you're going to sacrifice a lot of things to bring about, I don't know, I guess in the Christian tradition and the Hebrew tradition, it was called the kingdom of God, or the peaceable kingdom that Isaiah could foresee, he envisioned. And that's where I think the word plowshares probably came from, that passage where the sword shall be beaten into plowshares, and to turn violence into harmony. And to do that requires great suffering of somebody. Somebody's going to have to suffer. So if you were the person calling for peace in 2001 and 2003 and on and calling for climate action back then, today you're the person who can't say, I told you so. That's the last thing you're going to say. You have to eat it. You have to eat it. And if somebody, just the way that other people had to eat our mistakes when we were younger and whatever we did wrong yesterday, somebody's got to eat that. So that's kind of part of the metabolism that has to happen now. I don't know, I guess if you could raise your physical hand, it's probably easier. How many people have heard of a French mystic in the, I think she was in the I think she was during maybe World War II. Her name was Simone Weil, W-E-I-L. Okay, so she's, okay, great. She was, I think she was Jewish. She lived in France, but she began to have visions of Jesus, I think, and she'd heard of Christianity and she didn't really like Christianity, but she liked the sayings of Jesus and began a kind of mystical journey with that. I'm not really sure how all that happened, but she's really wrote some amazing things about what we're talking about. And of course, it was a very violent time and there was suffering everywhere. And she said something I think is really key at our time when so much is at stake. And y'all, all of us who are willing to digest difficult things, you're looking around at huge amounts of destruction, suffering, violence to digest. I heard recently it's being called the polycrises. Like it's not enough. We're not having a crisis. We have so many crises right now, like the mass extinction, the climate, the people running out of places to live, the president of Hungary being the keynote speaker at CPAC, whatever it is, crisis after crisis after crisis, like how are we going to digest all this? So she said, and if you think in your mind to January 6th, what year? 2021. Okay, so if you saw any of these images on the news of the insurrection at the Capitol, I don't know what your response was, but I've heard it from other people, peace-loving people, just people in general. It's a natural instinct. You felt sick. It made you feel sick. It made me feel like somebody was cramming rocks down my throat for me to digest, to watch this chaotic mob, so angry, destroying the windows and the doors and beating things down and flogging the Capitol Police. And that's just one example, but it's a symbol, it's an image of the things that we have to digest now. So what's Simone, I'm not sure how you pronounce, Charlie, do you know how do you pronounce her last name?
Weil, I'm not sure.
I think
Okay,
it's Weil.
Okay.
W-E-I-L. E-I in German would be pronounced as a long I sound. Weil.
Okay, I didn't know if the W became a V sound or not, but whatever.
Could have been a V, Vile too, but Vile doesn't sound very good.
True, that's a good point. So something that she said that really can maybe help us all, like as a digestive aid to some of these things. She was talking about religion, basically, and Hitler used religion to justify his extermination of Jews, and so these things were very much in the forefront of what people were grappling with. But she said the false god with a small g, the false god turns suffering into violence. So when you looked at and I'll finish the quote in a second, but think back to that image of the people, the mob at the Capitol. So that's violence. Where did that come from? It came from suffering. So the false god, like that would Hitler would promote or whatever, would encourage people to turn their suffering into violence. But the true God, she said, turns violence into suffering. Now that's a very hard statement to digest because we don't want to suffer. And, the Buddha was probably the most famous for talking about this. And I heard a Zen master, a Buddhist teacher of some sort, maybe a Tibetan Lama or somebody, saying the interesting thing about Buddhism is that it is counter instinctual. It requires you to override your survival instinct. So there's Gary, I was thinking about the pain that he's been in. We are wired, our survival instinct is wired to avoid suffering, to take us away from suffering. So to walk toward it is a very, very difficult thing. But there's a third part. And, if you read the original text, you could actually Google that and get to the whatever that came from that she wrote. It's pretty widely posted. She goes on to say more about it, but it's kind of like, it's not very quotable. Who wants to suffer? So I remember the first time that I read that, the true God, yippee, the true God, we all want that, is going to turn violence into suffering. I'm like, well, which one's better? And if I really thought about it and I could go get an AR-15 and people are telling me I can solve my problems by joining the local militia and put on my camouflage play clothes and go have a play date with my fellow friends that are preppers and they're really good guys. We have a brotherhood and I can show up with my gun and they love me and they're going to fight for me. Violence, that sounds pretty good to me. If the other option is suffering. So, but all of our great teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh that just died this year, and Gorbachev, I don't know what Mikhail Gorbachev went through in order he sacrificed quite a bit to create peace with us, and we were not very nice to him. And Gene Edmonds, that y'all probably know from Plowshares, when I was growing up, Gene became a peace activist and she had 4 little boys to raise, and she drove around in a green station wagon, and she had a CB radio. We just thought she was the coolest mom on the planet. She was so fun. And we wanted to all get in the car and go wherever the Edmonds were going that day on a Saturday. And the station wagon would be just crammed with kids and sneakers going out the window and her CB radio. And she called herself the Green Lady. And we'd get out on the highway and she'd talk to truckers and she'd say, hello, Black Wall, or whatever the truck called himself, or whatever the other trucker would say. And she said, this is the Green Lady, come in. And we would all get to talk to the truckers. But in the midst of all that, she became a peace activist. And she went and met Gorbachev. I don't know if y'all know that. She met with Gorbachev. She's very modest and she's not going to tell you, but she went to Russia, and whatever happened with Gorbachev, I heard, I don't know if y'all have heard, the UVA has what they call a research center to research consciousness now, and they're researching the afterlife. Scientists, and Bruce Grayson is a doctor there. I guess was with the UVA medical school. And he was a doctor, he was a surgeon, and he was a complete strict materialist science, where the universe is physical only. It's not, there's no spiritual aspect to it at all. There's no afterlife. Consciousness is a product of the brain. And, we all came from rocks. We don't really know how, but that's all there is. And when you die, you die. So he began, Dr. Bruce Grayson, if you're interested in that, we've all got people dying all around us and we're headed that way ourselves. So, it is a topic of interest, what happens. And he began to notice that his patients in the ER or the intensive care or whatever Gary was just in with his pain, if they were in excruciating pain or losing their life, basically, he would have gone down the hallway, to get a drink of water or something and rush back in. And later they would tell him, oh, I saw you go down the hall. I saw you drinking water and you spilled the water down your chin. And I saw that you had like a tomato stain on your shirt because you and your wife had spaghetti. And he's like, no, you didn't see me. You were unconscious. And they're like, no, I saw the whole thing. I heard what y'all were talking about. And he began to get really interested in this and began to study it. But how did I get on that topic?
Consciousness.
Yeah, I'll wind my way back. I know it's like on the back of just right on the tip of my consciousness, but well, anyway, I'm not sure how I got there. It'll pop back in, but I really recommend looking into that. And I think his book that came out a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, I think it's called After. And it's these researchers at the UVA Center of Perceptual Studies is what they call it. And I think they had to give it like this abstract name so that they could continue to exist, because it's not materialist science, and they are studying that consciousness is not local. Somehow that had to do with digestion and metabolizing. And peace. So the reason that I really began to think about this as a topic just in my life personally was when the pandemic happened. I swore I would keep my parents out of nursing homes, and I moved up from Wytheville for that reason 4 years ago. My mom had Alzheimer's. My father had a different kind of dementia. And it's interesting about the people studying the afterlife also study where the consciousness of people in those conditions will wander in and out. But when I moved up here, somebody wanted to buy my house and, paying monthly. It was a young single dad. And I gave him all my furniture in exchange for him taking on my 2 old cats. I didn't feel like it was fair to move them. So that was going okay, but it was too much for one person. And I was still working, teaching online and writing and editing and researching. And I just started to get really, really sick. And so I began getting caregivers to come in and help me. And I was allowed to use my mother's cabin. She had not been able to use it herself. And I would patch together caregivers and go out to get a break for a couple of days at a time and then go back into Roanoke. And things got so bad. My dad was taking the wrong medicine. He almost hemorrhaged to death. Walgreens gave him like triple dose of blood thinner. My mother, it was just, and then the caregivers turned out to be kind of corrupt, and things were just kind of going kaflooey. So I finally agreed with my brothers to put my mother into memory care in Roanoke, a place called Brookdale. And it was December of 2019. So I was able to go visit her every day. She absolutely hated it. And my mother had a kind of Alzheimer's where she was very conscious of people. She was a very gracious, she didn't become a mean person. I think it's because she had developed her heart intelligence her whole life. She related to nature, to clouds, to people she loved. She was so grateful. And I think even though her brain had problems, her heart intelligence was completely intact. And so it was a completely wrong thing to do, to put her there. And it was bad enough when I was able to go every day to visit her. And she would be sitting on the sofa like a little child with her hands in her lap, watching the door, watching the door, watching the door, waiting for me to come. And then there was the shutdown. And I couldn't go see her and, multiply my situation by millions of people in similar situations. And she, of course, she didn't understand why. And if you were lucky in those situations, you could call the front desk and ask some kind staff person who's already overworked, because people are quitting right and left and not coming into work. Ask them to take their cell phone back so that you can talk to your loved one who does not know how to use a cell phone and has no phone and has no way to communicate with you. And if you're lucky, they'll go do that for you. And I would talk to Mama and I'd say, because she didn't understand. And I would say, well, Mama, remember the polio? Remember the polio when people couldn't go to the pool and they couldn't go to summer camp? And it's like that. And she said, it's just so strange. She said, I know I did something really, really bad. I did something bad, so nobody's going to come see me. And by that time, and by the way, Jean Edmonds, my mother was Jean Edmonds's camp counselor at Scout Camp when they were teenagers. And her husband, Buddy Edmonds, was my dad's best friend. So people like Jean really got me through the whole thing of the adventure of elder care. But, every other day I'd call up Jean and I'd say, Jean, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I can't leave her there. When are they going to end the shutdown? And she, I'd try to do the through the window thing where you could go with your phone and they would put the person on the other side of the window and talk to them. She didn't understand. And so I would see her on the phone talking to me and she would be so excited, but say, look, Mama, and I'd bang on the window, look, I'm here. And she would be looking down at the phone like, I know, I see you. But she wasn't seeing me at all. I mean, it was just so frustrating. And but Jean kept, and I'd say, Jean, what do I do? What do I do? And I wasn't well. By that time, I was just really raggedy and not getting sleep at night because I have lung problems that popped up in all this. And she'd say, Liza, what happens if you take her out now and something happens to you and you can't care for her? What happens to her then? So I asked the people at Brookdale, what happens if I take her out and then she has to come back? And they said, well, she would be quarantined in solitary confinement in her room for 14 days. And so, one thing led to another. And I finally prayed for her mother to come get her. I prayed for my grandma that died when I was 19. I asked her to come get my mother. And she did. And she came to me in a dream, and I'd never dreamed of her before. But we were in a park in the dream and walking along. I was so excited to see her. I was like, Grandma, you're here. I can't believe I'm seeing you. And she wouldn't look at me and she didn't talk, but she had a small smile of acknowledgement and beautiful fall colors. It was a very vivid dream. And when I woke up the next day, I knew that it had been her and she was coming. And within a week, my mother had fallen and was back in the Roanoke Memorial Hospital. And I finally got to go see her, but it was just, she was already on her way out. And I called hospice, and it took my mother 10 days to die, with no food, no water, not moving. She lay there almost like an Indian in a canoe. She reminded me of an old Cherokee. She was part Cherokee, put out in a canoe and sent down a river. And she was watching something very intently over her head. And I felt like she was getting instructions for the next world. But then my father, I refused to put him in a nursing home. My brothers were like, he needs to go, and we've got to sell the house. And, but there was no vaccine still, and there was nothing had opened up. And so, they let me stay at the house with him in Roanoke and take care of him. He wasn't right in his mind, and he was so angry at me all the time. But I think it was finally February of 2021 that the vaccine became available, and it went first to the care facilities. So I finally relented, and he went to Our Lady of the Valley in Roanoke. So, and we were able to sell the old family house. So I finally had time to start digesting this this past year. And when I thought about the suffering that my parents went through, I felt that I could have prevented it. And I talked to Jerry quite a bit about it, because Jerry Moles took care of his mother for 10 years. For 10 years. He said he came back from California to Roanoke because they told him his mother was dying. And he jokes and he says she died for 10 years. And Jerry was housebound. I remember we would have land trust meetings, and Jerry would have to get a caregiver, or just call in and not be able to go to it. So, in recent months, while I was trying to process the suffering that my folks went through, I remember thinking, God, I don't think, I was just devastated by the suffering, even though it was over with. And I remember thinking, God, I can't metabolize this. And this is just one example of suffering on the planet. And it's a first world problem. It's not like, when then Putin invades Ukraine and starts smashing stuff there and killing people, and that happened, I think, began in January of this year. And I'm like, I can't metabolize any more of this. And it finally dawned on me, I got a kind of answer. And it was, you don't have to metabolize this. You can't metabolize. None of y'all can digest the suffering that you've already seen among people that you love in your life, let alone the planet, let alone Ukraine, and the political corruption. It's too much. And I said, well, if I can't metabolize it, what is to happen? And the answer seemed to be, we are to be metabolized. We are to be digested by these things that we don't want happening. They are here to digest us and to alchemize us into a new creature, like something that is suitable for the time that we are in. And I guess that's really an ancient teaching that I hadn't thought about before. The symbol they used to use was alchemy. And I think there were literal alchemists who would try to turn lead into gold back in the Middle Ages or whenever that was. And then there was the mystic people like Rudolf Steiner and that flowering age in Europe of mystic visionaries. They used alchemy in a more symbolic way. And Carl Jung, I think, did also, where the lead of you come into the world as in a larval stage, and you're a consumer, and you live to survive, and you have to be fed, and you take things, and you take and you take. And at some point, there's this, ideally, this alchemy where you're not a larval stage anymore, but you have gone through a cocoon and you become a butterfly. So that is the and finally, just the last part of that is, that's what Simone Weil was talking about. She was expert at suffering. Now, like, this person, she never had enough suffering. Like, she made herself, her family had enough money, but she insisted on going, like the everyday workers, to the Renault plant in Paris and working in a factory, horrible, grueling conditions. And she was not healthy. And she refused to go home and sleep in the bed of her family home. She asked these people that lived on a pig farm or something if she could go live with them in the pig shack with the mud, and that was where she slept at night. And she wouldn't eat. Why should she eat when other people were suffering? So she died. She died from that harsh suffering that she went through. But I think that we are really called to live, obviously. And so the third part of what she left out, I think, if the false God turns suffering into violence, the true God turns violence into suffering. And then what? Well, that's the next part. That's the butterfly. And so that alchemy happens. The old person that you were is gone. You don't have to carry around the load of yourself anymore. You don't have to worry about what people think of you. You don't have to defend a reputation. You're relieved. And I really think the Buddha discovered this. And I think that Jesus, when he said, I can't remember exactly how it goes, Michael probably does, but it's like, come unto me, all ye who are heavy laden, and I will refresh you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And to pick up your cross and carry it. Well, what could that mean? I kind of think it means that your old self, that is such a burden when you're younger, is dissolved by all these horrible things that we don't want happening. We don't want to digest, just like after 9/11. When you get metabolized and alchemized, you don't have to worry about your the things that the burden of yourself. You're freed from that. And so they look at, I think the Dalai Lama is a good example. I heard him interviewed one time. He said every day he grieves. He listens to the BBC and all the horrible things that are happening on the planet, and he prays for all these people. And then he grieves for Tibet and everybody else that is suffering. He grieves for 20 minutes. And then the rest of the day, he's like, looks like an elf. He's in terrible pain and has, physical afflictions, but he just has this expression of joy. Because he's light. He doesn't have a burden of himself. And the other two examples, and then I'll shut up, but I think two good examples of this kind of alchemy that the peacemaker is called toward. One is George Washington Carver. He's my hero. And if you really read about him, I think that he was born at the end of the Civil War. So I think technically he was born as a slave, but his parents were killed somehow or died, and he was adopted by somebody else, and then I think abandoned or something. And he was just like a waif, but he was so intelligent. And I just picture him as a little child walking toward, somebody took him in and let him work for them, and he began to invent things. And they realized how smart he was, and he got some education. And the whole during Reconstruction after the Civil War, nobody had anything to eat. Robert E. Lee, after he surrendered, was invited to teach at Washington University in Lexington. They had been devastated. Their buildings had been smashed. They had nothing to pay anybody. And he took the job and didn't have any furniture. He took a job for, I think, almost no pay, like room and board. He and his wife moved to Lexington, and later I think they called it, I guess it was after him that they called it Washington and Lee University, but nobody had money, and everybody's hungry. The soils had been ruined by tobacco and cotton, and nobody thought about regenerating the soils, even back in Thomas Jefferson's day. It's like nobody's putting stuff back in the soil. So along comes George Washington Carver, and with no malice, no resentment, despite the ill treatment that I'm sure he met with, his life was just metabolized into this feeding the entire South with the peanut. Among other things, he invented all kinds of things and little cottage industries where people could survive. And you can see pictures of, I was telling Gary that I found one I wanted to use if I weren't so inept at using Zoom, but if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see a picture of him with the fellow teachers at Tuskegee. They had no money. Their students had no money. They barely had anything to eat. And the first day of school, I think he said that when the students came into class, he didn't have equipment in the laboratory. So the first few days of school, he sent everybody out onto the streets and around the backsides of town to go to the junkyard and to pick stuff up out of the back alleys. And he said, just bring whatever junk you find, bring it back, and we're going to create a lab. And then that's what he did. And he created a laboratory, and they began investigating how to regenerate soil. And so that's one example of this amazing metabolism that is possible to turn violence into suffering and suffering into a kind of communion of joy. And the last thing I'll say, my last example is Scrooge. Scrooge is my other hero. And believe it or not, it's like, I have a feeling things are going so fast now, it'll just seem like Christmas is next week. I really recommend, for years, I recommended to my students, or even incorporated it into class, a rereading of A Christmas Carol. And if you really it's a nice little, tiny little paperback, you can get stacks of them to hand people. But that book, that little story, and it's interesting that Dickens wrote it because his family was hungry. They didn't have any money and he needed to pay off a debt. So he wrote that really quickly. But it's just a miraculous story, the way that it came out. And it's not preachy. It's not a Christian right type of hogwash. There's no mention of the baby Jesus in it. It's just a story of flat out suffering. The suffering, the grime, the coldness, and Scrooge, who had a horrible childhood, it turns out, and he goes back and he wanted to avoid suffering. It was so painful. His childhood was so painful to him. His father rejected him. He was sent off to school. He became a young apprentice, and luckily to a really good master Fezziwig. But when you see the Ghost of Christmas Past taking him back to the scenes of his boyhood, you're like, oh my God, that's why he was, I think they call that now childhood trauma. The ACE, the adverse childhood experiences. Well, he had them. Well, no wonder. He didn't want to hurt anymore. And so, of course, he barked at Bob Cratchit and barked at the guys who came to collect money. And bah humbug, you use Christmas to rob a man's pocket every 24th of December. And he goes, but he's forced by these three ghosts to look at the suffering. He's forced to digest the sadness, and it transforms him so that by the last chapter, which we always forget about, people use the term Scrooge. It's a derogatory term, but really look what happened to him. And the last chapter, if you read nothing else, the last chapter of A Christmas Carol will really give you hope and really offer a way to change your life, because he wakes up and he throws open the window, and it's people are out in the streets like, what day is this? What day is this? And the little boy shouts back, what day is it? It's Christmas Day. And and Scrooge is like, oh, what a delightful child, where he's usually barking at children and chasing them away. He's like, oh, what a wonderful boy, clapping his hands. And he sends him down. Y'all probably remember the story, but he's like, could you go to the butcher for me and get that great big goose that's hanging in the window and bring it back with the butcher on the double, and I'll give you some huge amount of money. And they come running back, and he sends it. He's so excited, and he claps his hands with mischief, and he's like, I'm going to send it to Bob Cratchit. Nobody will come up with a better prank than Bob Cratchit getting this goose, and he won't know where it came from. And then he does that, and then he goes off to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner, and he's never gone. He's never paid any attention to them, and they're like stunned when he shows up at the door. And then the story ends where he spent the rest of his days bringing joy to people. And if you think about that story, nothing has changed. It's still grimy, poverty-stricken, horrible industrial London with the sewage running down the gutters and the crippled children and the, Dickens, I think, pushed for some reforms, and some reforms began at that time, but nothing changed. But he had changed, and it said some people laughed at him because they called him a fool. Like, what happened to him? But he didn't care. He was happy that they were laughing. So that's a story of metabolism, and I think it can give us all hope at this time when we're really besieged with horrible things happening, and there are more coming down the pike. We all know that. And we don't have to avoid suffering like we did with 9/11 and like we did with the climate for so long. And we can help other people not be afraid. We can help them. So that's the end of my part of the story. I still can't remember why I brought in Bruce Grayson, but you can look up his book, and it's wonderful.
Perhaps we can open it up to questions now, Liza. Folks
Great.
have
And any comments from anybody?
any comments or questions from folks?
I loved your examples, those 3 examples that you gave. I had forgotten about Simone Weil. I read some of her stuff a long time ago, but hadn't thought about her for a long time. So thanks for bringing that back to my consciousness. I'll have to go back and look at some of her work. I thank you for all the things that you said. You really had a horrible time there with your parents during COVID. It was a tough time for so many people. The isolation was so bad. We had a tough time because Susan was sick during that period, and it really had a health crisis. And I know what you mean about the isolation. Sometimes I couldn't go in either to see her. So I'll think of something more in a minute, but I just wanted that was on the top of my head.
That's wonderful. And thank you for saying that. And you just wonder how many stories that we have no clue of the people around us that would happen during that time. And
Liza, I
Joyce.
really liked all the metaphors you used about metabolizing and digesting, and what we have to digest. And I certainly get where you were going with alchemy. I think in a Christian context, we would also call that transformation. And Jesus says you have to lose your life in order to gain your life. Richard Rohr talks about that's the work of our second half of life, isn't it? Where we really lose ourselves. Where you put it in a different context, but it makes perfect sense. We are digested by all of this suffering, but can come out new beings, and that's the hope in all of it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Richard Rohr. He's another resource I really, really recommend, especially like it looks like everybody but Sherman here is probably past, Carl Jung said that midlife is age 36.
Ooh.
Age 36, that he considered that midlife. And it was time to change from external, like wanting the world to give us, and it was a kind of weaning process. And that like moving from like what you just said, Susan, and to lose your life, he who would preserve his life will lose it, and who will lose his life can save it. And Richard Rohr really guides people into the elder years in a wonderful way. And I think one of his books is called Falling Upward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're especially in our culture that Robert Bly and Joseph Campbell pointed out that American culture is stuck in a juvenile larval stage. And the universe is trying to get us to evolve and to grow up to full stature, to grow into new beings that are not consumers, but we are wise people. And Richard Rohr sees the second half of life as the appropriate time to fail. You're gonna fail, or the people around you will be suffering. You will suffer. There will be disasters, and all the things that you thought you were here for, which was success and having things go your way, and having a nation that's not, whose government is not corrupt, or whatever it is that we wanted. But all of that, and Richard Rohr says that is the way of evolution. It's growing down. And Richard Rohr says that to evolve, he calls for elders. And he said, we have a lot of old people, but we don't have very many elders. And to become an elder, he said there's no other route he has ever seen except through great love and great suffering. That is how you evolve. And if you love, you will suffer. Because whatever you love will be suffering, and you will suffer right along with it.
Joyce, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, the accumulation, and I really appreciate so much, Liza, of where you took us on this journey. But I've heard this period referred to by cultural historians as we are in a cultural tsunami right now.
Yes.
The effect of a tsunami is the strength, and well, we all remember what that is. But really, the one thing after another for the last several decades has been overwhelming to everybody, and finding balance daily is such a challenge. When you spoke of and I liked Susan's addition of, I was thinking transformation too, and that whole metamorphosis. But Thomas Berry talks about how the importance of what we're doing right now is we need to invent the new human if there is to be survival and on planet Earth. And I can only imagine that the next human needs to have a smaller ego and a larger heart,
Mm.
and whatever else needs to come from that. But do you think that's part of what you're talking about this evolution, our transformation to really a new species?
I think so. And what you said, Joyce, made me realize all the ways that we try to avoid that, because we are wired to avoid pain, and our culture is very, very good at that. And that's one reason we have all this stuff rupturing right now that got deferred for so many generations. You know, I read a book, who was it that wrote Stuart Little? E.B. White.
Yeah.
Okay, and Charlotte's Web. So if you read, I had occasion to read it to a youngster in the family recently, and I was amazed to see, I guess it was written in the 50s or 60s, they were dumping their trash in the ocean. You know, that was like, I think Stuart Little got caught on the garbage ship and out to sea, and they were like dumping them in the ocean with all the garbage. So in a way, we've come a long way, but look at all the stuff that we put off because we could always go somewhere else and destroy that piece of land and then move out and take some more timber from some other place. And now I think we've run out of places. So when Joyce was talking, I just pictured, you know, Elon Musk offering billionaires a way to get off the planet. And then now we're going to go terraform. Like, we can't take care of the terra that we already have formed. We have no clue how to even keep from destroying it, but we're going to go off to Mars or some other place, and we're going to suddenly be wise people that know how to create life. So I think that gives people an escape route. And I think that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the video games and all the stuff people get caught up in now. There's a book that is on my list to read, Anna Lembke, called Dopamine Nation.
Mm.
And I don't know if y'all have heard her interviewed, but you can catch an interview at YouTube or something. But she talks about that we have these energetic loops to keep ourselves from suffering. And you can hop onto any of them to avoid digesting these problems, many of which, to be fair, we didn't create. But I think you're right. And Thomas Berry, you know, he saw the earth as, it was coming from the Jesuit tradition, but he saw the earth as the crucified Christ. Like, that is the body of God, if we could only see that. And to have to see what we're doing is just so painful that it would require becoming a new person to survive it. And I think that is exactly what our job is now.
Charlie, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah. So many things, Liza, that you touched on were so beautiful. One that really spoke to me was the example of the Dalai Lama giving a certain amount of time to grieving. How can you not grieve so many crises and so much human suffering? And yet he recognized that you had to limit that or it would take you down. You know, we could spend our whole day, Ukraine would be enough, but we know it's 10 things beyond that. So that example of him, and I loved your example of George Washington Carver, whom I don't know that much about, but it reminded me of another very inspirational Black man, Howard Thurman, who also had every reason to be bitter growing up in Florida and dealing with, you know, Jim Crow, but he transformed that. And to go back to your major image of the alchemist or the transformer, you know, we're not going to get around suffering, but the very suffering in our lives and on the planet can lead to something deeper if we don't shut it off, if we let it move us forward. Anyway, so many things you shared, and I love your heart. Thank you for everything that you have shared with us today.
Thank you. And I know Jerry wants to talk, but I would just like to acknowledge, I was actually going to mention Howard Thurman. I'm so glad you did, Charlie. Charlie, I've learned so much from Charlie's books that he puts together, and he finds these incredible excerpts from people and he puts them together in this little harvest of wisdom and puts these things out. Like every day, Charlie has written a new book, it seems like. But it, with excerpts by people like Howard Thurman, but I listened to some audio recordings of him not long ago, and he talks exactly about what Charlie just said. And he talks about, he used the metaphor of storms, and he learned from his boyhood when they hardly had anything, they depended on firewood to cook with and to heat the water, and it was just essential. And they hated the storms because the storm could rip the tin roof right off and destroy the livestock or whatever. But the storm also brought down a lot of dead wood. And he would be sent out to pick up the dead wood and bring it back. And man, they had plenty of firewood for the next week. And he used that metaphor, and he said that he had learned in life, and this is, he was the inspirer, wasn't he, Charlie, of Martin Luther King Jr., like a mentor?
King would carry around with him the Dispossessed, one of Thurman's books. King apparently always had it at his hand, so yes, he was a very powerful mentor for King.
And I think, and so he, those were, like Charlie said, terrible suffering, unmentioned suffering, and he didn't carry any bitterness. And he and Gandhi taught that to Martin Luther King Jr., the ahimsa that Gandhi lived out, and Gandhi got it from Jesus and whoever, in the Hindu tradition. But Howard Thurman said that when these horrible things happen, there's a lynching, there's Jim Crow laws, everything's unfair, the little children don't have food. All of those are the storms of life. And he said what he had learned is that, he said, all I have to do is open my arms wide and say, yes, I agree to this horrible situation. I agree. It's not enough to just bow yourself over, and like, okay, I'm going to suffer. He said, actually welcome it and to say yes to it. And that was the alchemy that invited the alchemy in his experience.
Gary, did you want to say something?
Oh, are you referring to me?
Yes, I'm sorry. Liza said you had something.
Oh, okay, yes. I want to go back to the Dalai Lama and I'm thankful for someone bringing that up. And if we go back to Buddhism, what the Buddha created was the means to escape suffering. And then if we think of the example of the Dalai Lama limiting the time of compassion, well, the Buddha taught this. You had to limit the time of compassion. Compassion is one of the 4 states of mind that the Buddha recommended we practice. If you look at the word dharma in Sanskrit, it translates in some cases as mindsets. And so what Buddhism is a set of mindsets that can be practiced. And in this case, they are the sublime states of mind, of which compassion is one. A second is metta, or loving kindness. And so one way is an escape, if you will, is to be loving and kind to everyone. Another is sympathetic joy, where we can't always be happy, but the Buddha taught when other people are happy, you in sympathy enjoy that happiness. And finally, the fourth is equanimity, to learn to be in control of your mind, where you can be at peace with yourself and still the mind. To some of the Buddhists, they call this the monkey mind. And so there are practices already out there, means to escape suffering. And as we delve into Buddhism in some depth, we see this. And what this does is give us an even keel, a platform from which to operate. We can observe the suffering in the world, but we also have alternatives, mindsets of loving kindness, sympathetic joy, equanimity to survive and live. And then from this stance to make contributions given what we see is needed.
Yeah, I found this a very rich talk. I'm fascinated by the image that you offered, Eliza, about, sometimes I wonder, we keep going through all this stuff. It seems getting worse and worse, but being transformed from a caterpillar to a butterfly by all this suffering, I guess, is a very interesting concept for me. I'm also reminded years ago at a Quaker conference, I met a guy who had, he was going to be shipped out for Vietnam. And instead of shipping out for Vietnam, he went AWOL, and he ended up in Paris. A lot of the resistors, fled to Europe. And he was in Paris when his father died. His father died back in the United States, and he couldn't attend his father's funeral, or he would have been arrested and clapped in a federal penitentiary. And he had become friends with Thich Nhat Hanh. And when Thich Nhat Hanh heard about the suffering he was going through because he couldn't be there for his father, Thich Nhat Hanh had an interesting reaction. He didn't commiserate with the guy, but he invited him to come to the Buddhist center. Thich Nhat Hanh was in exile in those years from Vietnam. He invited the guy to come to the center and just learn how to sit in Buddhist meditation, because that is one of the highest ways for being compassionate, I guess, is to just, to learn to detach. I've always remembered that too. But, and that's been kind of where I've, because of my Buddhist background, have come out of. But I find the image of caterpillar to butterfly very helpful. I'll think about that.
I had one question.
Yeah, go ahead, Truman.
Liza, how, when you're talking about this transformation, are you talking mostly, does it start with the individual, or how much of it is collective? There are a number of these cultural crises happening all at once in our society. I wondered about that. You also mentioned the garbage barge. That's an example of, I study economics college. That's an example of an externality where somebody gets something simply for free, but they don't pay for it. Somebody else is paying for it. That's a problem throughout our whole society. I just wondered about that question. Is the transformation, how much of it is the individual transformation and how much is the collective transformation?
Yeah, those are really good points. And it reminded me, some years ago, I read there's a conservative economist teaching, I can't remember what university, and I've forgotten his name, but he mentioned kind of to what you spoke to, Sherman. He called it, we privatize, the person who is a polluter. This man found in his students, his research, his grad students found in their research that regulations actually improve the economy, and they are good for a company and they're good for the workers because they create more jobs. And of course, the company wants to cut labor costs. So you want to frack for gas and plow through people's backyard with the Mountain Valley pipeline as expediently as possible, creating all kinds of damage that everybody else has to pay for. But he said that these people pretend like they are anti-government, but what they're doing is they're socializing their costs and privatizing the profits. So you're bringing in the raking, they used to call it raping and pillaging, like you go in and you take whatever and leave damage. But whether we transform, we don't have, I'm thinking that we don't have we're not Greek gods on Mount Olympus, and so we cannot force the Proud Boys to stop meeting. That's the rules of the game, and that's very humbling. We can't force some kind of transformation. Nobody forced it on us. Like I got away with horrible things when I was a child and at school, and I mean you could come up with any kind of example, but for some reason, you know, and I've had a few arguments with God about it, kind of like Job, like why is this, why that? And the answer is, well, you're not God. Like I have chosen to let these horrible things happen. And I was telling, I think Gary in a note, that C.S. Lewis wrote a book about this because, you know, he became a believer later, maybe as a professor or something, and he heard all kinds of arguments against the existence of a God, one of which is suffering and along with it, injustice and evil. In the one of those Psalms, why do the wicked prosper? And you know, Susan can speak to this. I'm sure you've heard this chewed to death over the many years in the ministry. It's like a main topic at seminaries. Why do the wicked prosper? Why would a good God let, as they used to say in whatever book came out in the 80s, why do bad things happen to good people? And that it is a mystery, but C.S. Lewis said, it's the rules of the game. It's the planet, it's an even playing field. Like there's no special treatment. Like you don't get, you know, if you're nice to the referees, it's not going to make you win the game, or you just agree to it. And I find that in itself, I didn't used to, but now I find it very valuable, kind of as to what Susan was saying about Richard Rohr and growing down and being humbled. You become humbled by having things not go your way, and people are gonna go storm the Capitol, or they're not gonna play nice. They're not gonna stop putting out garbage instead of the news. And I call it getting weaned. So I've made a habit, and I was going to ask y'all if you have a daily, just things that you do in your own life that help you get weaned. And for me, when things go wrong, I'm like, okay, yippee. Like Howard Thurman said, just say yes to it. Okay. Oh, good. Another chance to get weaned of having my way. And when Jerry brought in the Buddhist practices, there's a Tibetan Lama named Zopa, Z-O-P-A, Zopa Rinpoche. And I don't know if you've heard of him. I think he's still alive. But I don't know, years ago, just out of some catalog, like it was like even before the internet days, I would get Tibet House offerings or some Buddhist publication offering books. And I was like, oh, this title sounds good. And it was a Zopa. He had written this little book called Transforming Problems into Happiness. And I remember thinking, if anybody knows how to do that, I want to know how to do that. Because we've got a rich harvest of problems. The harvest is plentiful, and the laborers are few that know how to turn the harvest into something good. And I really recommend it, ZOPA. But it's exactly about Sherman, what you're saying. Like he shows you as an individual, you can metabolize horrible problems and bring good out of it. And that and the key to that, he says consistently, and I've read other of his books now, and they all say the same thing: get rid of the self-cherishing thought. The self-protecting thought. He said that is the cause of all our misery. And like what Jerry was saying about the Buddhist practices, the self-cherishing thought, or somebody else was saying, I think Joyce, about the ego, we need more heart and less ego. And he calls the ego the self-cherishing thought. And you want to quite naturally avoid suffering, and you want quite naturally to enjoy happiness, instead convert it. You can read what the Dalai Lama based his life on. It's called The Way of the Bodhisattva by some mystic guy, Tibetan guy named Shantideva. And you can get a copy of it from Shambhala Press, or it's probably online, and just read that thing and you're like, oh my gosh, he's recommending that you walk toward suffering and go sleep in the boneyard with the bones. You think you want this wonderful romance? Well, go sleep in the graveyard with the bones. And this is really what you're wanting, is this person who's really a walking corpse or whatever. I mean, it's just a very, very different way from our culture of thinking, but it is all about dissolving the self-cherishing thought, which I think might be what Jesus was talking about. Like, that's why Jesus's burden was so late. He had gone off, and I don't know what happened when he went off in the wilderness, but somehow he came back and he was a late traveler. He did not have to worry about what people thought of him.
Well, we've gone about an hour and a half now. I can, if folks want to leave, I can keep the Zoom link open though, if folks want to continue to discuss. But if anybody feels the need to leave, we have been going on for a while. Yeah, Charlie.
No, I need to leave. Thank you so much, Liza. This has been rich.
Yeah, thank you, Liza. This has been
Thank
wonderful.
you. I wish I could wave at everybody and smile, but I'll try to get to the next meeting, and somebody can put me on the mailing list, and I'll figure out my technology to get the security off my camera.
I'll be in touch about your honorarium. So, this has been recorded. Well, we've got a Plowshare YouTube channel, so it'll go up on there. So, thank you.
Good. And you can send that to a Ukraine effort or whatever, any of the millions of needs that are out there.
Okay, I'll do that, and I'll let you know to which organization I send it. Thanks, guys.
Goodbye, all.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Good to see you,
Bye.
Joyce. Good to see you,
It's
Charlie.
really been wonderful.